Hi guys, and welcome to our 10th lesson of this series Blender for Production 2D and 3D tracking workflow. My name is Helge Maus from pixeltrain. Thanks a lot for all the new subscribers and really the help you give me by supporting my channel on Patreon or also on YouTube, and the nice feedback and also all your questions. I really appreciate the communication with you. In this lesson now, we want to wrap up this scene. As promised in the lesson before, we want now to talk about the tracking scene setup and how to integrate 3D objects inside of Blender into that. In production, I use sometimes the Blender tracker and export only a little bit of a block out, the camera data, and then I go into Nuke and I comp there my stuff. But I want to show you how to stay in Blender and which tools you have in your arsenal also to work here inside of Blender, and you will see it's great. As always, I don't want to have a fast effect with this tutorial. I really want to teach you how the tools work. So if you are looking for a faster result, you maybe find better tutorials about one scene, but if you really want to learn how the tools work, I hope you find here your answers. So let's get started. We start exactly where we left off in the last lesson. We have solved this scene here. You remember we only used 8 trackers, and then I added these helper trackers here, 0 weight trackers on the floor to make the coordinate system a little bit easier for me, so that we have a nice floor where we place objects. And we also solved here our cameras with the back of 36 millimeters, which is 35 full frame format. We have the focal length, the correct one, and we have here also found out our lens distortion. So that's important. You see here in my viewport these little artifacts here which show that we at the moment see, if you go here to the display, the undistorted plate. So that's important. We will talk about this lens distortion in this tutorial, so that's important that we have these data which are fitting here. If we look here through the camera, we see here now our background image, which you can do by clicking here set as background. And if you click here the camera, go here into the camera background image settings here, you will see that there's an option. Where is it? Here is it, render undistorted. So if you tick that here, you see that the image inside of your camera view is also undistorted with these values here. In this tutorial, we will now go step by step through different topics. The first idea is how to integrate a 3D object into a scene like this here. You know now, okay, we have undistorted the plate because every plate has lens distortion, and if you have a focal length under 50 millimeter normal lenses, we really have to tackle this lens distortion because in these areas which are close here to the borders, the distortion normally is so strong that you will see the difference between your 3D objects. So a 3D application like Blender and other applications use a system which is named a pinhole cam, so a lens-free camera, which make perspective distortions but not lens distortion. So you will see that a cube which you place, for example, in this area here, will have straight edges, but all the straight edges from the original plate will curve here in these areas. And so we need a distortion workflow. So we talk in this tutorial about a good lens distortion workflow. Then the next step will be talking about shadow catchers, because if you place an object here now, you need something which is, for example, a contact shadow, and you need to place an object inside of this scene. And this is something we have to render. And maybe also on the shadow, a little bit of feedback how the floor here is made. So if we have a snow, which is not even here, the shadow will break normally. And so this is something we have to do in rendering, so that we need a shadow which is broken. Maybe we also have reflections of the cube on the snow and things like that. So this is a topic also. So how to make shadow catchers. And we also talk about the shadow catcher in Blender 3.0. Then we talk about the Blender compositing setup. And like I've said, really often I export my camera data over to Nuke and my renderings, and I make the compositing there. But Blender has quite a good node-based compositing environment and I want to talk about integrating there. And for this, we have to tackle occlusions, because if we place something here in this area, we have this part of the fence, and this part of the fence occludes our object. And to do that, we need a technique which is named rotoscoping in VFX. So we can rotoscope in our compositing area. Blender also has a masking area which we can use for rotoscoping. This is also something we will use. Let's now look into the scene what we have. We have our soft camera, we have the right size of our scene, we have our coordinate system, but I removed everything which was here from the tracking scene so that I can show you what happens now if I click that. Let's first make a look here. In this area we see the view layers, and the view layers are the equivalent of render layers in other applications. We name them here view layers, and if you never heard about render layers before, I have a lesson here on my YouTube about the Blender compositing workflows and render layers, so you can refer to these lessons to learn a little bit more about how to do them. But keep in mind that at the moment we only have one render layer, which is named view layer here. This will change in a moment. Then if we go here to the compositor, you see at the moment I don't have anything here in the compositor, but this will also change. So if we now go here and click Setup Tracking Scene, we get here our helper objects, which is a cube and this plane here. And the cube is quite big, so first grab him and bring in one unit inset upward so that it sits here on the floor. And if we now look through the camera, you see it's quite a big cube. To work now a little bit easier, I will scale this cube down. So let's change a little bit here our viewport. I go here into a 3D viewport again. Press the 0 key on the keyboard so that we look through the camera. What we then can do is we can go here into the material preview if you like, and now you see, oh, the floor is gone. We talk about that in a moment. So let's go back here, but I don't want to see any overlays here. So remove the overlays for a moment here, and you see then is the background gone. So if you really want to get rid of the overlays, you can't use this here. What you can do is you can go in, say, I don't want to see the floor. I'm not interested in the tracker names at the moment. The trackers I will see. So this is something I want to have here. And if you want, you can have a wireframe with a low opacity only to have a little bit of feedback here. If you want to see this image here better, you can select the camera, go here to the camera settings, into the background images. And if you open this up, there is an opacity here, which you can bring up. So now our settings are done. And now I can go into this scene here, which helps me now, let's get rid here of the tracker names, to get a better size of all the stuff. So let's take first here this cube. I go with the tab key into the cube and I select, let's select the face here on the bottom. Shift S for the snapping menu, cursor to select it. So we set here our 3D cursor to this position. I tap out and then we can go to objects, its origin to 3D cursor. Now this cube has its origin in the bottom here, which brings me to the point that I now can press S like scale and I can scale him and it always stays here on the floor. Great. Let's go here to wireframe to see a little bit better what's going on. Then we select this here, make it smaller here and maybe rotate it around the Z axis a little bit. We will scale that here a little bit later. You will see why. That's now our preparation for that here. Great. Now let's take a look into that here. You see we have our new objects, the cube and the ground, but we have two collections here. And these two collections are important for our new render layers. So if you open this up now here, you see our view layer is gone. Instead of that, we have two layers here. One is named foreground and one is named background. The idea behind that is that these two render layers switch these collections here. To see better what they are doing, go here to the filters and activate these two icons. This is the holdout and this here is the contribution of the indirect. Now we see here these two columns. Like I've said, render layers is a topic which is a little bit more complex. Refer to the other tutorials on my YouTube channel, but the idea here is, if you go here to the view layers now, these are the view layer options. Let's look into the passes here to see what's going on. Every collection here can store these options here, if they are active or not, and if they are fully visible and interact everything, if you only want to see them as a holdout, or if you only want to have contributing them. The interesting thing is that if you have these view layers, they are rendered in a sequence. Blender will render now 2 times. One rendering is for the foreground, which looks now exactly like this here, only rendered. And if you go now here to background, you will then see that the output here will switch. Let's go back here to see that. So if you are on foreground here, you only see the cube. Later, you will see the Shadowcatcher. And if you go here to background, you will see that you now see the ground, and this is not 100% accurate, the indirect from this cube. So you see the scene changes, and Blender sets all these kinds up by using collections here. That's the idea behind that. More information in another tutorial. If we render that now, we can go in here, let's go to cycles here for rendering, go to sampling, and to make it fast, I go here to 30% noise, and I have a max sample of, let's say, 128. So it's quite fast. Let's render the whole thing. You see now we get the cube first rendered, and then we get only the ground with an interactive option. And these were the 2 render layers. Let's go to compositing. And now you see this here also has changed. So let's make our compositing setup here. I split the window, I go here to an image editor. I want to see in the image editor always the output of the viewer nodes. So this is my result. And then we can get rid here of the backdrop. Now you see this setup here looks quite intimidating if you've never seen something like that, but it's quite easy. Let's analyze what we see. We had these 2 render layers here, background and foreground, and you see we grab the information which they deliver in rendering here through a render layers node. This render layers node delivers what the foreground is. This here, what the background is. If I show you that separate, I have Node Wrangler installed, so I can Control-Shift-Click here to this foreground render layers node. You see we get the cube here as a result, and you also see that we have a lighting here going on, a little bit of shadowing. So this is really a 3D scene. If we Control-Shift-Click this layer here, you see it looks really strange. We get the ground here, which is in background here. You see we have rendered first the foreground, now we render only the background. But, okay, we see our switches are gone. We have to add them also in this layout. But you will see that instead of having only the ground, we have a shadow now going on here. First the contact shadow of the cube, and then this shadow here. And this comes from foreground. The reason why we don't see the cube is this toggle here. This toggle says indirect only. That means we don't see the stuff, but if you place stuff in foreground, like the cube, the indirect rays, so the rays which are not camera, for example, the shadow rays and the reflection rays, these are calculated. And this is something we now see here on the floor. We have to mix these information later. To have the original background plate, we use a movie clip node. We used that before, so this is the original plate. And now we talk about the lens distortion again. You remember, this plate here is the original plate. You see, this hasn't got the artifact which I talked about here. And if we now look into this layout here, you see here in the camera, we have this artifact here around. So this is the undistorted plate because we set that in the camera. We talked about that. But here, inside of the compositor, if we now grab the movie clip alone, we have the original plate. To make this now fit so that we have the same result like in the viewer and like we want to have it, we have to undistort the plate. If you have now the data in your camera, here, this is the data, we can now go into the compositor and use the Undistortion node. And this Undistortion node works like this. We connect here our movie clip where the camera data is stored, and then we say what we want to do with this data. And in our case, we want to undistort. That means if we now look at that, you see the difference. This is the original plate and this is the undistorted plate. If you make a closer look here, you now see the alpha around that. So you really see, like I've explained in the last session, that the plate shrinks inside of Blender to make this format here always fitting so that you don't crop it. And this is a little bit different like in workflows like, for example, in Nuke or in Synthesize, which really often can let the plate also increase its size. So inside of Nuke, for example, we have a concept of a bounding box, which is calculated outside of the final format, and later we can shrink it down again. Blender goes here a little bit of a different way. It shrinks first the plate, and later, if you redistort the plate, you are back to full format. So it's safer for Blender to do it like that. It's absolutely the same idea here. So this makes this Undistortion node. Then we have this scale here, which is a little bit strange because it doesn't seem to do anything. This has to do with Blender's idea that you can go here to the output properties and change the resolution here with the percentage for making faster renders. So if we go here and say I want to have, for example, 50% of this resolution, these two plates will render only in 50% of this resolution, and they are smaller. To have the correct result, we then have also to resize this plate here. But instead of typing in numbers and so, this scale node here has a really nice mode, which is the render size mode. So it automatically reads the render size here and says, yeah, I scale my plate so that it always fits to the render size. So that's housekeeping here. To now combine these, we use alpha over nodes. This is the merge node of Blender. Here you see we mix first the ground with the shadows with the backplate, which looks then like this here. And then we do the same thing here with our cube, and then we output it first to the viewer, which we see, and this here is then the result which we store, which is the composite node. So that's the setup Blender delivers us. Why is this so complicated? We have a big advantage with a setup like this, that we can go in here, and this is then later compositing work, which we don't do in this tutorial because it's about motion tracking, not final compositing. But what we have to do to get a really good integration is we have to match the colors correctly. So match the blacks, the whites. We have to match the color tint. We also have to match the grain and things like that. It's much more flexible if you have two branches here, because we now can add here color correction, which is not there, and so on. So that's the idea behind this here. I don't like this tree here. I want to show it in a different approach, but this can be working for you, but I want to have it a little bit more simple now for this tutorial. What we do here is we get rid of all this setup here. So what I do is I stay, for example, on background, and we name this view layer. Then we go here to foreground and kill that. So we only have one layer here. And now we can go in here and also kill everything which is here. So we need the ground, we need the cube, we don't need these two guys here, goodbye. And then if you really want, you can make now here new collections for stuff, for example. And we can place the stuff here inside of that. This is a standard setup, so only one render layer, it renders only one time, everything is here in. And then we have to adjust this here, so I get rid of one of these render layers node, we get rid of these two guys. If you control X, you will see that the connections here will stay. And this here hasn't been rendered, so if you want to render really fast, we can click here on this little render icon. So to render only that here, and now you see it renders in one step. Everything, the composite is wrong. Why? Because the composite shows that here, And we now have to mix these two things together. Let's take here an alpha over node. This is the background which we want to use. This is the scaled plate. This is our foreground. And then we set our viewer here and also the output of the composite. Now we have made a little bit of housekeeping, and I think this setup here is much easier now to understand. And now we can dive into the nitty-gritties of the Shadowcatcher. Okay, to make now a good Shadowcatcher setup, we will change some things. One thing is I want to see here now in the material preview the shadow of my light source, which by the way is a sunlight. I switched that over. So if you go here, you can go here, say I want to have a sunlight. You will see in a moment why this is really useful. But we don't see the shadow here. Reason for this is in the material preview world, we don't use scene light and scene world. So I switch on scene light. If you switch on scene world, you will see that the background is gone here. And I need this background here for some adjustments, so I stay with that. But now you see that we have here the shadow. The next thing you normally do, and this is a little bit different from production, is we normally go now into the original plate, try to analyze from where the light comes. I think it's coming here from the right here. It's really warm, it's winter, so the sun is not very high and so on. So these are the things I'm now looking for, and adjust then the direction of the sun here to get the shadow into the right direction with all the other shadows. And I also bring the sun up and down, make the strength, make the tint and all this kind of stuff. But this is not the topic of the tutorial. I want to show you a really prominent shadow for later for the compositing world. So that's the reason why I don't do the shadow now correct. I want that you see it here on the floor for this tutorial. So keep that in mind. Normally you make the light sources exactly like you use here the set or here on this scene. So now we see what's going on here, and now we can talk about Shadowcatcher. What's this a Shadowcatcher? If you have an image like this here, let's go here to cycles for a moment. You will see that the floor here is visible and you see the shadow. What we want in our case is we don't want to see the floor at all. So how to get rid of the floor? If you make it invisible, you will run into the problem that you don't have interactions anymore. You remember the indirect here. To have that now better, in Blender 3.0, we now have a new Shadowcatcher, which works quite well. So let's select the ground, go into the object settings here, object properties, go into shading, and not in shading, sorry, into visibility. And then you go in here. Don't change the ray visibility. It's absolutely okay like it is. We have to go here to the masking section. And here we tell now the system, I want to use a Shadowcatcher. And in the moment you do that, you will see that only the indirect rays are rendered. Indirect rays are shadows, reflections, and GI, but not the visibility. And now you see here is a really nice shadow inside of the scene. Keep in mind that Eevee at the moment doesn't support Shadowcatchers, so that's the reason why I have here the cycles at the moment on. The next thing which is important in the new Shadowcatcher is that also if you go here to light sources, we also have here a Shadowcatcher option. And this is important, so you can tell now the system if you want to see it in a Shadowcatcher or not. Yes, we want to have the sun inside of the Shadowcatcher. Activate that. And another thing which is inside of this Shadowcatcher setup in Blender 3.0 is if you work with render layers, which we deactivated, you remember, but if you work with them, you can go here into the passes, go down, 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 and here is now a new Shadowcatcher pass. The moment you tick that, it can happen that you don't see your shadows anymore. If you want to see them, then to check them, what you can do is here in the viewport shading options, you can go here to the render passes, and if you go here to Shadowcatcher, you see this is the Shadowcatcher separated. The lines here are for my wireframe, which I activated before, But here you can check these ones if you like. I don't need that, so I deactivate here the Shadowcatcher, go back to combined, and now we talk about here the shadow. The problem with our shadow here, if we want to later integrate the whole thing, is that this shadow here is too perfect. Yes, you normally have to go into your light source and make some adjustments. For example, you increase the angle here of the light source so you get a softer shadow here. Then you go into the tint, all this stuff. But you don't break the shadow with that. How to break the shadow? A shadow catcher really interacts with your objects. And this is something I want to demonstrate now. You see here on the cube has a really neutral reflection here. Nothing is going on here and the shadow is perfect. Let's select here this plane, which is not visible at the moment. Interesting. We go into the materials and make a new material and we say this is our shadow ground plane, whatever. I go here now in the preview mode and say I want to have this here blue. You suddenly see that the blue surface will change the GI, the indirect reflection, because the indirect rays, sun is hitting here and it's reflecting here, is then contributing to other elements. So this is important. So if you really want that you have on your cube here an interaction with this environment, you can go in here and say, yeah, we have here something brownish, here is brown, here is snow, and so on. And you can add a texture to this surface, which really reflects that. And by the way, reflection, let's go here to the cube and make here a material. I say I have a not too bright base color. I don't want to have this here rough, so I go down, 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 down. And I think you see it here. Maybe we can make this a little bit more obvious. Yeah. You see that we also see indirect the reflection of this floor. So the Shadowcatcher also delivers reflections for us. So that's the important part. So if you really have a shiny object here and you want to show that it's integrating into the scene here, you can give this ground a texture which is snowy, which has the right colors and so on. And this will reflect and also change the GI of the floor. Okay. We don't want to do that here. So I go back here now, make my roughness here back, and let's take a brighter object because I have to show you later the rotoscoping, so it's easier to learn if you have a brighter object. And you see that this GI here is really killing it. So let's say we want to have something in this color here so that we have something better here. Okay, how to break now this shadow? You have seen that the Shadowcatcher material is doing a lot for us. And to now use that, we can use also things like bumps. This is something we can directly do in the materials. So let's make here a new layout, a shading layout, for example. Okay, now we see that here. We still can look through the camera and we see I want to use the scene light here, scene world, then we don't see the camera image. So it's not so important for us here now, but what I want to do is I take a new node, which is, for example, a noise texture. Let's hook it up to my node wrangler to see how it looks. I would say that the scale is not big enough. Let's make it something like that. So you see it's really fast here. Now we also can change the detail and so on. And what we do with that now is I go here into vector, take a bump map node, and this is wrong. It has to be here in the height. We get now a bump map, and then we hook that up to the normals. Here we go. And if we now take a look here, you now see the floor is now bumped here. And we can then change here the strength. Let's go back into our motion tracking setup, and now you see suddenly our shadow here is broken. And that's the whole idea. So I think this shows you how you can start manipulating the Shadowcatcher material itself to make this here better, to really change the appearance of the indirect stuff. And now you normally go in after you've found the right reflections, the materials and so on, and make a nice light integration, which I don't do at the moment because this was a demonstration how to do that. Another thing, this Shadowcatcher here is only catching the shadows in the area where the Shadowcatcher is. That means if you have a Shadowcatcher which suddenly is too short, you will run into problems. So if you go here now and I select this edge here, you see the Shadowcatcher only calculates to this part. So what I really often do with Shadowcatchers is I block out objects in my scene. You can also capture shadows which are going here, for example, in this area here. So if the sun comes from this side, you can extrude that here, bring it up, and then if you go then later to our sun here and change the direction of our sun again, you will see that the shadows also crawling here over the fence and so on. That's the idea of helper objects here. Okay, I think I explained a lot about the Shadowcatcher. Let's go now into the next step, which we have to go. And this step here is now how to render this now correctly so that we have occlusions here. And for this, we need rotoscoping. If you want to rotoscope something inside of Blender, you have your own environment, like the movie clip editor for tracking. And like the movie clip editor, I told you that the UI is not on the same level like other areas in Blender where we have tools and so on. You will see it's a little bit old school, but now you are used to that. So let's get started. You have here a masking area. You can use that here if you like, or you can also go here into VFX and open you a masking area. And in this masking area, we have 3 sections. First section here is, if you take a look here, a movie clip editor in the mask mode, okay. If you don't see your clip, go here into your movie clips and open it here. Looks really familiar here now, but now you're in the mask mode. On this side here, you have a compositor, which normally shows a background image. You know, I don't like that too much, so get rid of that. And instead, divide here these windows and show the viewer node here. So now we have that here. And then we have here a dope sheet. And this dope sheet is really interesting because I know from many trainees, they are looking for their mask dope sheet because they lost it. This is a little bit different from the movie clip editor tracking workflow. This mask dope sheet here is really a part of the original dope sheet. So if you search for that, go to dope sheet, and inside of the dope sheet, you can then go here to mask. And this here is the keyframe area where we have these mask dope sheets. Okay, then we now want to understand what a mask here is. And for adding a mask here, we have this big new button here. This is one way of making a new mask. Another thing would be you go here to add, or in your add menu, you have a circle and a square mask, or you can directly start drawing a mask with Control click. And you will see that in the moment I do that, the T menu here on the left will change, and also the N menu. Like I've said, it's a little bit old school. So bear in mind that you first have to start a mask before you see the tools. Now, let's talk a little bit about how to rotoscope. This rotoscoping process is the same rotoscoping process like you have in applications like Nuke or Fusion or After Effects. It's really the same rules. Don't try to rotoscope everything in one big chunk. Try to split it in easy static objects. Then you can combine these elements to masks, and then you use the mask in the compositing process. So absolutely the same thing. So if you want to dive into rotoscoping, all these tutorials are good, not only the Blender ones. But the first thing I normally do is I try to understand where I need my rotoscope, because rotoscoping always takes time and I don't want to do more work than I should do. Let's go first back to the motion tracking world here and look here through the camera and try to understand what we need. we have the problem that here this cube should be occluded by this fence part. If we are here in frame 0, you see that we have here the fence, but we also have some gaps inside the fence where we want to see the cube. So this part here, this here, I think here is also one, and maybe we touch a little bit of this gap. No, maybe this one. If we go here to Z, we see here, okay, a little bit maybe is important here. So this is the starting point here. Let's go back here to the camera and go back to cycles. Okay. Then we are moving, and you see we move here to the right with this cube. So I see, okay, less and less of this fence is important. We have this gap and this gap. And then at one point, I think it's around frame 100, we really don't need to rotoscope here anymore, because now we are out here of the whole thing. Keep in mind that we see here the undistorted plate, because that's important later. We have 3D objects which are undistorted by default. Pinhole cam was the word for that. And so we need to check the undistorted plate here, which is absolutely correct here. And we have to rotoscope between frame 1 and frame 100. What I really often do here is I go into my timeline, which is that one, and I make markers here. So you can go here, press the M key or that here, you can make a marker, and then you can also rename the marker here to given the job. So roto fence front end, and so you can make job descriptions here for you, start, end, and things like that. And this can later help you to don't do work which are not necessary to work. Then I go back to masking, and now you see that we have here in this dope sheet also these markers, so we know what we have to do. But we will see, and this is now a pitfall, you will see that the plate here, look at that, has no artifact. And this should be the alarm clock for you. So what you see here is the original plate. Be aware of that. So go to clip display and say we want to render the undistorted plate. Now you're really seeing what you later get. And this can change a lot, like you see here. So make sure that you see that. Okay, next thing is I know now between 0 and 100 I have to work. And what I now normally search is for a frame, a good starting frame for my mask. And for this, I normally search for the frame where the object which I have to roto is big in the frame, the biggest appearance, and also the most details. It's not so easy because we are now at frame, let's say, between 50 and 60, really close, and then we are rotating out here. So I would start maybe in frame 50 or let's say 60 here, because here it's biggest, and we can start good here. Now let's make our first roto, and then we talk a little bit more about that here. I start my first part of the mask with a square, and like I've said, at the moment we don't have a mask at all. That's the reason why we don't see anything here or here. If you click start, you get it here, or you can add here a shape, you get a new mask, and now the mask normally is at the left corner here. So that's the mask here. If you want to select all the points, you can press the A key, the G key for moving around this area. Everything which works in Blender works also here. It's absolutely the same thing. Okay, these are 4 points like in splines. You can move them around, and what I want to do is I want to have here my fence, and I don't need this part here because we know that we only need a really small part of the fence. So I start here bringing this here around that. Let's say, yeah, I think maybe this gap was important. I'm not sure, but let's make something like that here. Okay, so now we have this area here. Or we can even make it bigger. Maybe it's easier to work like that. Okay. This is our first part. If we now take a look here, you see this is the mask, and good habit, name it. So this is fence front, because later we maybe have not only this fence, we have occlusion here, we have occlusion here on the floor, and so on. So the final result of that is always a mask or more than one mask. And these masks are addressable here from the compositor to work with them. But inside of every mask, to split your work, like I've said, we don't want to make a gigantic high poly mask out of that, because then Roto is really complicated. We have layers. And so this is the layer stack for this mask here. If you need a new mask, you can click here, make a new mask, and then you have a new layer stack. And then you can address it separately. But we only have one mask at the moment, fence front, and so this is the layer stack. And we say this here is, for example, the BG, the background, the big part here. And now comes the job of a rotoscoping artist, and I know it's not the nicest work. What we have to do now here is we have to animate this shape. To animate this, we can select all the points, press here, for example, the I key, like insert keyframe, like in the animation editor of Blender. And now you see here we have a new keyframe. What you also can do, and this is something I do now here, I activate the auto keyer, so every movement here is automatically keying. This helps me to don't forget to press the I key, but I wanted to show you that you really can key also with the I key here. Now there are some really interesting things inside of Blender. I think maybe we can make later a real compositor training inside of Blender, so maybe this is then the better place to do that, but only to a short notice. What you can do is, you see here that all your tracking markers are still there. And if they are annoying for you, you can go here to clip display, deactivate here the paths, deactivate the patterns, and so on. But these are here for a reason. What you can do, every of these points here has here a parent option. That means you can parent points of a mask to existing trackers. I taught you in the last lesson how to make zero weight trackers as helpers. Same thing here. What if you say, I want to move, for example, a point accordingly to a point here which I have tracked as a zero weight tracker. So you can pin it to that, and this helps. Or you also can make a plane track. You remember there was a full lesson about plane tracking in the 2D world of Blender, and now it makes sense because a plane track helps you. And you can use this as a parent. So if you want to look into this tutorial again, you now see why this was so important. As a little example, what I want to do is I select all my points here. You can press the A key, or if you have more parts here and you don't want to select anything by accident, you can click them with the Shift key. The active point is always the last one, which is here white, or you can press the L key over this shape. And so L selects everything which is linked. So I have all 4 points now. The last thing I select now with the press down Shift key is this tracker here, which is an original tracker. Like I've said, for rotoscoping, I really often make my own helper trackers, but this is only an example. And now I can use the Control P, like parenting. And now I parented all these points, not only the active one, but all these points. We can check that by clicking through them here to this movie clip, to this camera, to tracker number 4. If you have named them nice, you can open this up, and here you see our helpers, and then you can see helper, big shape, or whatever. What now happens is, if I now move my time indicator, you see, this is not the best example, but you see everything is moving now accordingly with that. For these 2 trackers, it helps. It's nice. You still can make offsets. That means if you go back to 60, here it fits, and then you go to frame 30 and say, this here is great, it still works. But you see, these here are off. You still can move them around here to the right place. So that's no problem at all. That's cool. It's like an offset. And also here, I make a little bit of a correction, but you see, the whole moving process of adjusting and adjusting and adjusting is much easier because these points are all fixed to this tracker here. And now I go through my whole shot. I go now to frame 0 here, make again my correction here. And hopefully this was it. So for this shape, you see, not bad at all. Don't overdo it here. Why? Because we use only this here to remove parts of the cube. So this here is not so important because I know that on this side here, nothing really happens. So that was the interesting part why I really want to analyze first my job. Okay, let's say that's it for this part. Let's talk a little bit more about this mask and then we go into the holes and things like that. This mask here lives at the moment between frame 1 and frame 100, and this is also important. Funny enough, it's frame 100 because we said, okay, we only need this mask until 100, but this was by chance. So if we want to deactivate a mask, you can use these values. And after frame 100, this mask doesn't work anymore, and that's cool. So it switches it off automatically. So that's nice. You can set it here. Then every of these masks here have, beside of their values here, a feather. And for this, maybe it's good to see a mask. You have here your own display for the mask. And here, if you go to Overlay, Combined, you see that we get a pre-mult of this here. So you can see what later this area is, but you only see it here now in the positive direction. We later need it in the negative, but yeah, it's a good helper. Then we also can see the alpha channel, and like I've said, we have a sharp edge. If you want to make it soft, we can use feathers with scale feather, but this is something out of scope for this tutorial. Like I've said, maybe we make something like that later. And what we also can do is we can change the opacity of a mask here. So that's the idea behind that here. Okay, now I want to show you how to use that here, and then we can talk about the holes here. Let's go here and make a little bit more space here for compositing. To now get a mask here, we can use a node with a nice name mask. You go to input and here is a mask node. And you now can tell here which mask you want to have. Fence front, so that's this thing. And if you control click now here, you see that's the mask here we get now as a result. Now we can use this mask, and now we come to the point how to use this mask. If we go here, let's render first this cube here in this frame. Okay. We can see that's the cube here. And it's then brought over that here. So what we want now is we want to combine these two. To combine these two, we need a node, which is under converters, set alpha. This is one idea of doing it. So this stream here has an alpha, which looks like this here, but I don't need that at the moment, for example. And I go now here to the complete image and I say I want to have this image here. And I want to use for this image here, this alpha here, which comes out. And now look at that. We get exactly the opposite of what we want. If we now plug this in here and take a look here, you only see now the cube in this area here. So how to invert that? A mask is nothing else than a black-white information. So what we can do is we can go here to colors, invert, and go here to invert. And now you see we get that here. So that's the whole idea behind a normal mask. We can inject alphas, we can invert them. If you have more than one mask here in this area, we can use math nodes for that. If you go here and we have somewhere, let's go here to convert as a math node, you can add them, you can multiply them, you can subtract them. Many, many different scenarios because they are black and white data. So we can work with them. We also can blur them. We have a special erode and delete functionality, which you maybe know from other applications. And we also, beside of set alpha, we can pre-mult also the stuff. If you make this now nice, we have some things to do. We have these holes, and I don't want to do that now completely here. I want to demonstrate now how to work with that. So for this, we start in frame 60 again, And what I now do is I add a new layer here with a plus. Now we have a new layer and we say this here is the opening A, for example. You can click here to activate a lock so that you don't by accident touch this here. And now I want to show you how to draw a mask by hand. Hold down your control key, you are on opening A, and click somewhere. And now you add points here. And I do that by going here a little bit around. Let's make first an example. If you click and hold and then you move your mouse, you see you get a little interesting helper here. This is a really special kind of mask here because you only have one handle. It's much easier to work with this here than a Bezier curve. If you want to close something, you can tick here cyclic or Alt-C on your keyboard. And if you have finished something and you want to add points, you can control click here on a spline to get a new point. If you want to get rid of a point, select it and press the X key. And if you want to change interpolation for one or more than one point, select them, press the V key on your keyboard, set handle type. V key is the same like in the animation editor and so on. And here you see you have auto, Bezier, and you have vector. This is the normal Bezier. You have vector, which is a sharp point here. You have aligned single and aligned is the normal Bezier here, which you know in Blender for normal working. So this is really like curves in Blender. But if you go here, select everything with the L key and you press the V key and say now vector, you get sharp edges here and you can work with them here. And like I've said, closing would be cyclic or Alt-C. I don't need that here. This was only an experiment, so I select all the points and remove them. And now I go in here and make only 4 points. So I click, 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 click without dragging. Alt-C to close that. Then I select all my points and say here vector. So now I only have vector points. And now I can start here adjusting these points. If you need more help with that, or sometimes a black and white image is better and so on, you still have here the clip display of the movie clip editor, so you can go here to black and white if you like. And never forget render undistorted, otherwise it doesn't fit. And so we have now something like that here. Great. Now comes the question, what is the mask which this here delivers? Because we have 2 mask layers now. And for this, I go here into the mask display and select alpha channel. So this is the alpha channel which we get, and you see this here is wrong. And you also see it here in our display. We still don't see the opening. Every of these layers here have options. And you see here we have the opacity. Okay, doesn't make anything here. We have blend, fall off, and so on. If you go here to blend, you see we have the same operations which I told you in the compositor with the math node, plus, minus, and so on. So what I can do now here is I can say subtract. And now you see this here is opened. And look at that. Now we see the cube in this area. That's the whole idea behind that. What you now do is you go here to this opening here and do the same thing. This time we don't use here a tracker as a helper. So what I would do now is I go here now in. You can open now that here. See, this is our first keyframe. So go some frames to the back. Select all these points here. Press the G key for grab. And now you can make here your adjustments. And that's the way we normally work here. This takes now its time, but I think the process now is clear. Okay, I think that's quite enough for today. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below. If you like this tutorial and you really learned something which you like, please give me a thumbs up, subscribe. If you want to support me, you can become a Patreon of me, or you can write me something nice. I would be really happy if you follow this journey with me through the Blender production world. Have fun with Blender. See you next time, your Helge Maus.